Um, with Santi's blessing, I'd like to take a full moment of silence with you. Um, I'd like to just take a moment to reflect, to remember those we've lost and recognize those who are suffering and honor the grief, the difficulty, the fatigue, the transitions, and some of the sort of very emotional and difficult and important parts of our lives we've experienced over the last couple of years in particular. Thank you. I think it's important for us to recognize what's happening in our bodies. We don't always have a chance to pay attention to. So pleased to be in conversation. Big fan. And I'd like to start by asking you what song you go to for solace, or if there's an artist. Well, turn on your mic, lady. No.
Hello. There you go. All right. Well, for solace, I've been going to things that I grew up listening to, partially because there's the nostalgia of just being sort of supported by, I grew up in a house that was full of music and it was happy for me, and so there's that. But also the music that I grew up listening to was topical music, and it talked about fighting for what's right, and it talked about community, and it talked about the things like, Fela Kuti is one of my favorites, and it just feels like peace for me, even though he's talking about so much that's not peaceful, but that's what that music feels like to me. And people like Nina Simone and Marvin Gaye, and so I've been listening more to that than any current music, really. Yeah.
What's the first song you remember?
Ever?
Would it maybe been one of those artists?
I'm really bad at like first and favorites.
I know, me too. But I like that. I'll give you a second to think, because there's an exercise that we used to do in classes and thinking about listening, which is, what's the first song you remember? What's the first sound you heard today? What's the first album you bought? What's the first concert you bought your own ticket to? Which we're not going to go through any of those. And then the last one is, what's the first MP3 you downloaded? Which some people remember.
I don't remember any of those things.
It's okay. We can pass. You can take a pass on anything I ask you.
There's a story about me seeing James Brown with my dad in concert where I was too young to remember. And I remember a lot. So I must have been, very young. And I said, Dad, what's wrong with his leg? And my dad said, he got soul. So I'm sure James Brown was one of the earliest things that I heard in the house, along with like the Temptations or something. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So you wrote a statement. You gave a report from the field. I'm asking Claire is going to help us by putting links to that in the chat in case it's something that people need to read. And how do you see that? How do you talk about it for people who haven't had a chance to sort of catch up with what you're thinking about?
Well, I released a record this year in September, and I was, there's a lot that goes into the releasing of a record, and years of preparation and years of, content. I mean, because you make the record and then it's like you've got to spend another year making content almost nowadays because it's like the record isn't enough. So
How long were you songwriting before that? Did you have a batch or did
for
you
this record,
yeah.
I was writing during the pandemic. Um, but I think about four of the songs I had already started. They were from demos that I had from other stuff, dating from like a couple years before that. But they were just dormant skeletal ideas. So I started during the pandemic writing the record, and I finished it during the pandemic. It was a very um, cathartic process. It was like a necessity that I was going to write some music during this time because it was really the only thing I had to I created my own lifeline. It was the only thing that I had to grab onto was what I was going to create during that time because otherwise I was just so overwhelmed and just so distraught and all the things that we all were feeling during that time. So I wrote the record and then I was releasing it myself for the first time, which was a big deal.
When did that change happen business wise?
I left Atlantic after the last record, which was the last record came out in 2016, I believe. So I had done a sort of mixtape record in 2018, which I licensed to a company. So it wasn't necessarily on a record label, but I licensed it to a label for the release. But this time I was like, I'm just going to do a distribution deal. And I mean, things have changed so much. So you can do that and you don't have to give away your masters or license. So I was just like, oh, this is great. But in trying to like pull everything together and do videos and get money for everything and figure out how you're going to use Web3 and how you're going to use this and how, are you going to do NFTs and are you going to, just there's so many new developments and TikTok, or it's just like, it's so much that has nothing to do with the creation of the art, which for me, that's great for a lot of people. But for me, I actually care about the art and getting it to the people. And I understand that to get it to the people, now you have to do all these other things, but it takes so much time and energy that it leaves very little time for the art. So that to me doesn't make sense. There's already a disconnect there where I'm like, wow, I want to be spending my time making art, but I'm spending all of my time trying to figure out how to market myself and get money for all this extra stuff that now is central to being a musician. And I also have 3 kids, so I was also doing all the work of like dealing with the kids following the pandemic and going back to school. And anyway, the pandemic's not over. And so still like, oh, COVID, okay, this or that, and finally, also I started a podcast and a line of teas and all these other things. Cause I'm like, oh, it's part of the record. I have all these other things because you always have to have all these other things. And they're taking a lot of time. And then it was like, and shows and festival, a couple things like, and then it was just like, okay, tour's coming up and you have to, for me, that's a big thing because I spent a lot of time preparing the show and, the concept.
Do you prefer live or studio or both or?
They're very different.
Bring lenses.
They're very different. And I like both of them. I like doing shows and I like creating a world in the show that feels like the physical manifestation of the music. That's really fun. And it's an opportunity. It's a whole different set of creative focus. But you need money to do it. And it costs a lot. Everything costs a lot. And that's the thing. Everything costs a lot in making music and getting the music out. But then what's happening is you're making less and less music. Making less and less money coming in to support everything that you're doing.
And also making less music.
And therefore making less music, right? So when it came down to like planning the tour, we'd been planning it, but all of a sudden, I've been touring since 2007. And I've never had a tour other than the very first tour where I wasn't going to make any profit at all. And all of a sudden I get this budget and I'm like, wait, what is this? And they're like, oh yeah, there's not really a profit and it's a loss, but we're going to make it not be a loss. And I'm like, you're going to make it not be a loss, but how am I going to support myself on this tour? I'm leaving my family for like weeks or months, and I'm not going to make any money. They're like, yeah, but you really should do it because da, 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 you need to. You can't. You got to keep the momentum going, and social media coverage and the fans. And I'm like, but how am I going to pay like my bills? You know? And they're like, we'll find something. Months go
When you
on.
say, just to be clear, like when you say we, you have a team, you have a booking agent that's coming to you with that. Is that management? Like who's coordinating
There's
that?
lots of team, and they all get percentages as well. So
So they're interested in you working.
well, yeah. And even if I did that tour where I made no money, they would have made, there was like, definitely money on the table for everybody else. It's only me that wouldn't make money, even the crew. And everybody's rates have gone up because of inflation.
And our crews are getting paid a little, and crews are hard to book right now.
Because there's so much work, because everybody's out on the road right now post pandemic. Everybody's rushing back in after not being able to work for the years of the pandemic, and no venues being open and nobody being able to leave their house and go get in crowds. So everyone's like kind of missed years of income and are rushing back in. So all the venues are booked, the tour buses are booked, the crew is booked. And then also, which I said in the letter, the gas prices are like astronomical. The tour buses are overpriced. The flights and the hotels, everything is like way higher than when we left. So really, for many artists, there wasn't that much profit being made in touring anyway. I mean, there's profit, but it's not like so much that you can afford for all that inflation and still make it a profitable endeavor.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's been interesting with the conversation that's coming out of artists, particularly in this moment, not only you, but Arlo Parks, Lord. I mean, there's a lot of conversation coming up also about the business. And there's a freedom to start that artists are building out a place of freedom to talk about our experience. But one of the things that I didn't know, as someone who's self-managed and self-booked at this point, I didn't realize that there's frequently 30% in some deals. I'm not asking about yours in particular, but that was something that I didn't know, that there's just a 30% off gross that's coming in from management in some deals. So that's something that even someone who pays a lot of attention to the industry, I was really astonished, because there's just there's no skin in trying to there's no skin in trying to expand the money beyond like the 30% off the top. And
Well,
not that people aren't working, but still.
No, but I think people don't understand. I think there's so much people don't understand about what the actual experience of being an artist is, and the business of being an artist. And I think there's so many misconceptions about, if people know your name, then you're rich. You know what I mean? And you're happy and you're fine. And then the artists perpetuate that, with social media, because they believe that that's what people are buying into, this idea that you're larger than life and that you know, you're not human just like everybody else. And so it ends up biting us in the butt, really, because then you're creating this unrelatable facade of being sort of untouchable and perfect and like happy. And then you're expected to constantly keep that up, and then also withstand all the people who are like tearing you down, because you're being like this fake big thing, and people don't like that anyway. So you withstand that, but you have to constantly keep going, and then you have to constantly keep in front of everyone too. So I'm going off topic. Yes, we don't make all the money that we earn, and so a lot of times people are like, "Oh, can you do this gig?" There's a lot of, can you perform for free and for good causes and for this or for this art event? But it's like, hey, there's actually a cost of even showing up, because I have to pay my crew, I have to pay for rehearsal, I have to pay for people to get there. So no, I can't perform for free, you know? And then if you just pay the cost, then I'm the one. Yes, then I'm performing for free, but it still costs money. So you get asked to do that all the time because people don't understand. Oh, can you do me a favor? Can you do the show for this amount? I'm like, No, because you're not even taking into account that there's like, 30-40% off the top of that, then taxes. So that's leaving a very small amount of income on the gross that you're making. So that's already like, imagine like any money you make, you're losing like a huge, like more than 50% of your money before you even get it. So that's that. But then there's the other thing, which I was just starting to get into about um, the pace of consumption and the idea that to be an artist you have to be like constantly accessible, constantly in people's face, constantly releasing albums, doing shows around the world all the time. You release a record. I've seen it. I release a record and like 2 months later, when are you releasing a new record? Like, what? Like it's just crazy. And so what's happening is even the artists who are not, having financial difficulty are having difficulty physically, emotionally, mentally keeping up with this pace of consumption that's not human. I think everybody, whether you're an artist or not, is having trouble keeping up with this pace of, the smartphones being accessible all the time, having to reply right away, having to do work constantly because it's constantly coming to you. Um, and and also having to do so much to survive. I mean, everything's so unaffordable for everyone. And the idea of having to do so many things just to have a basic living is is requiring too much of people, and I think that um it's just clear that our country doesn't care about people. And it affects artists just like it affects everybody else. And I think it's really important to start framing artists in that light. At all levels of success, we are ultimately workers who are being just as affected by the lack of respect for humanity as everybody else.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah. I'm curious, just what was the timeline of you coming to the decision that you did? I mean, I know you have perspective from different points of the industry, but what was that just sort of 1 week where you're like, actually, this can't happen? Was it after this meeting? Was it something that had been brewing as you started growing your family? Do you have a conscious sense of that?
I do. I mean, there's, there's years of
You don't
me.
have to share.
No, there's years of me not enjoying touring because it's just like I view touring. I mean, there is moments where you're on stage. You said, "Do I prefer doing shows or studio?" Well, there's a part of me that loves doing shows and loves being able to be in the community of people who appreciate your art and them giving you energy and you giving them energy, and it's very special. But when you're doing and I insist upon not more than 2 shows in a row and 1 day down because I lose my voice, which is a whole nother thing. It's like you lose your voice that costs you thousands of dollars if you cancel one show that you pay. If somebody gets COVID even now, thousands of dollars. I mean, it's so that's the thing. But then I was doing even still 5 shows a week, let's say, right? For months on end. And as a mother, when I had my last tour in 2016, I took my son who just turned 2 on the tour. So I'm there with like an infant child doing 5 shows a week, and being a mother in the mornings before the show, and it was really hard. And it's hard. Now I had twins. And, the thought of that being how I make a living is not really attractive to me. But still, so then you say, okay, well, I can go out for shorter bits or whatever. But then when you're like, and I'm not going to make money, and how am I even going to pay somebody to watch my kids, and how am I going to pay my rent when I come back or my mortgage or whatever, right? And so I knew in my heart that this didn't make any sense, but I've known things in the music industry don't make sense for a very long time, and I've still been doing it. But
that's the way you go to have things make a lot of sense.
No, no. And then we keep going because everybody keeps going. And if you don't do it, somebody else is going to do it and you're going to lose relevancy and blah, 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 blah. So there's all these reasons why you keep doing something that is totally not fair and makes no sense for you. So I was going to do it. And my managers kept, you have to do it. You have to do it. But something in me kept saying, yeah, let me think about it. Okay, well, can you tell us on this day? Yeah, sure. That day comes. Let me think about it. So I was just pushing it off because I wanted myself to do it, but I had just written this record about like honoring your own boundaries and being true to yourself and respecting humanity and like, and my body was just like, you have to do what you know that what you've been telling everybody else to do. And so when it came down to the day and I just had to make a decision, I was like, I can't do this tour. And they were like, are you sure? And I was like, I can't do the tour. Um, Physically, my body's not going to do it. I tried, but my body's telling me no, you know? And so even though I knew in my physicality that I just couldn't see it. I couldn't see going on the tour. I didn't know I wasn't going to do it until it came out of my mouth that day.
No, thanks. I think that because I think that artists come to realizations at different times, and we don't really share that timeline. So I appreciate that because it's part of, I think that, as I said, us sharing our experience in all sort of whether it's granular, intimate, larger, it's sort of what we are in position to do right now and that you're doing so well. So I
Right.
appreciate that.
And the thing is, I'd had so many conversations leading up to it because I'm a sharer, and I talk to my friends about everything. And also I can't figure out what I'm thinking until I've told about 10 people. Luckily, I have a lot of good people. But I'm just like, well, and I tell the whole conversation, then I call somebody else. So, and I repeat the whole thing. And I love it because I have people who are just wonderful, who give me, great conversations, great things to think about, and great advice. In fact, once I had decided to not do the tour, I was like, I have to write a letter to my fans because I have to let them know what this is about. And it was 11:45 p.m. I remember. And I was like, nobody's up, like, my friends. And so I called my one friend, Dave Siddick, who is in TV on the radio, and he's up all night and then he's up early in the mornings as well. And I called him, I said, Dave, I got to write this letter. No, 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 no. I had written the letter, but it was a book. And I said, Dave, how does this sound? And I read the whole thing and he was like, well, you've got like an op-ed and a letter and also like an essay. And he's like,
that's a good friend.
Yeah. And so I just, I kind of whittled it down because there's so much to say about it. There's so much. And the thing is, I've been having these conversations with my friends and everybody was feeling the same way. Everybody was struggling at all different levels. And yet everybody was just kind of putting their head down and continuing to lose money and not being able to do, and silently. And I just tell it like it is. I can't not. That's just part of who I am. I just have to. If you ask me, people say, how are you doing? And I'm like, well,
real, for real.
I don't really want to know, but I'm going to tell you.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that with Steve's kicking us off today, one of the case studies for those of you that weren't in the room, one on the Zoom is a account of being on tour in the mid 1800s. And it sounded really familiar. Right? So, there's so much that we could dig into, and I would love to just talk to you for days. But I think that idea of I'm curious of this is an age-old industry story in a lot of ways. And I'm wondering, I feel like personally, there's some really acute things that we're dealing with that are changing the landscape in terms of just income, right? Which the things that you suggested, even the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what's happening with fuel, what's happening with, hunger, what's happening with transportation, obviously the pandemic, the endemic, there's just, there's tariff issue. There's a lot that feels like it might be of an era a little bit, or maybe this is our continuing future. Maybe it's heightened. And I'm wondering, I'm just curious about this moment for working artists in this sort of, and excuse me if this is too opaque, but I think this idea that if touring has always been hard, do you get the sense from talking to your peers that this is something that will pass? Are people kind of kicking it like 2 or 3 years down the road? Are people tapping out? Is there just sort of like, this is how it rolls, this is what we do, and it doesn't always work, and sometimes it does, and we're just artists and we keep going? Do you have a sense of that among your group? Because that's like, I was really astonished, and this is not answering that question, but I was on a Zoom with some musicians during the pandemic, during the summer of 2020, and found out that there were some people that were selling instruments, right? From bands that people would be shocked to know that they had to sell instruments to pay their rent. So I think that, and those people are playing again now. They're just like, that was bad. We did that. We got it back. Now we're back out on the road. But I'm wondering if this is a long bump for us, or if people are tapping out. And then thinking about that natural progression of a career, and as you have your family, you're obviously a writer, projects that are coming forward. Did you feel like this was on the horizon and it maybe moved up, or is, just musing around some of those questions with your community and with your own sort of idea of what you want to be doing?
I think there's been so many changes to the industry over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years and more, that have made it more and more impossible to sustain being a musician in general, being a touring musician. I think this particular set of circumstances is very specific, and I think parts of it will pass. But I don't think that the general problem faced with creating a systematic change in the structure of the ecosystem of musicians, I don't think that's going to pass. I think it's going to get worse if we don't actually address it and start figuring out how to make it more sustainable and fair,
Right.
Streaming has totally just changed the ecosystem. And I don't think anyone's figured out a way to make it work. And so touring as a shifting, the idea of where you get your income from, selling records to touring, was never a fix that actually worked. You make way less money touring, most artists, than you would selling records. And nobody's going to go back to selling records. I mean, yeah, you can sell a little bit of vinyl here, but that's not going to ever replace that income source. And then touring currently is kind of like, it's not as viable an option right now. And it may become, maybe once, if gas prices go back down, if less people go out at once. But then you've got the festivals that are kind of faltering as well. They're having a really hard time post pandemic, and that is something that I used to use to sustain the tours. So you would put one festival here, one festival there, and then do your shows in between, and then all of a sudden you could afford the tour. But if those festivals, we did have one and it fell through, because they're struggling. So when you have that makes it even harder. So it depends. Like if festivals can come back and if venues can get on their feet, then maybe touring will level out and become something that's doable. And the assumption of like the booking agents and stuff is that it will, but they don't really know. But I think that a lot of musicians are just sort of burning out on the idea of that being the only way to sustain themselves. So I do think you are going to lose people, and I'm seeing it happen because it's been a struggle for a long time before the pandemic, and now with this, it's just like tapping out. I'm going to go score films, or I'm going to go, I'm going to get a job doing something not in music. Because at a certain point, I think people are like, this is not what I signed up for. I'm an artist and I don't want to be a marketer, like a marketing genius, and
Yeah.
and so I think you are going to lose some artists for that, because it's so hard to make a living, and because it's also shifted to something that's not what they were called into it for. And then as far as changing the trajectory of your career when that happens, the thing is, for somebody like me, I've never really considered myself just a musician. Um, that's why I don't put out records all the time, to be honest. I once heard Joni Mitchell do an interview, and she described making records like and then taking the time in between records as like to letting a field lay fallow, and so it needs to re-enrich its soil, and just like an artist needs to find new inspiration. And when you're putting out a record every year, what more do you have to say? Honestly, if you're really trying to say anything in your music, what more do you have to say? Like a couple months after you just finish. I mean, now some people just, that's what they do. That's what they need to do. They just need to keep making records. But every artist is not the same, which is a huge point. Every artist is not the same. And for us to all have to be plugged into this little narrow version of like, what we should be doesn't work. Whether it's as a Black musician trying to do music that doesn't fit what's the Black music category, or whether it's like you have to be on social media all the time, like most of your day, every day. All artists aren't going to go for that, And so, where does that leave those artists, right? So for me, I love making things that aren't music just as much as I love making music. So I took the time during the pandemic to start a lot of projects that I hadn't had time for before. So I came up with this book idea that I wanted to do. It's a memoir, but it goes back 4 generations of women in my family to my great grandmother in Mississippi in 1886. So I just got a book deal. So I'm going to write this book. I also have a film project that I'm working on. My teas, and I have like 1,000 ideas a day too. That's just who I am. And I love being able to just plug my creativity into other mediums. So what I'd like to do is figure out a way to create more space for myself to do that, and still make music. I love making music, but I'm not going to continue to do it in a way that is so unbalanced and so unhealthy and so unsupported by the very people who say that they love music, or the companies that make their living off of what we do, but don't support us.
Yeah, I always said that there's one of the things when revenue streams and different revenue streams started being with technology, there were different ways to access finances, and there was always this conversation about like, I think very important for artists who are working, or anyone, to recognize their potential revenue streams where they can get compensation for doing their work, and that's a really important thing for artists to address with their own practice. But there was one time where I was really frustrated, and I thought, I feel like I'm someone who's I want to drive a bus, and everyone's like, okay, well, you got to design the bus, then you have to go get all the materials for the bus, then you have to put the bus together by yourself, then you're going to get the bus out of here, you're going to drive the bus over here, now you're driving the bus, we're not paying you for the bus, you got to make a t-shirt about how you're driving the bus, and then you'll sell that, but people aren't really getting on the bus anymore. So maybe you can talk about, right, and I was just like, man, you just can't win. Like, you just to be able to just play a guitar or sing. And I appreciate you bringing up that what we need to foreground, which is musicians have really different experiences in terms of genre, in terms of, someone is on the festival circuit and they're having a really, they're booming right now. There's all sorts of ways of working. But what I feel like I'm hearing, and it seems like what you're hearing too, is that there is just this intense level of depletion, and there's this intense level of having to work beyond a scope that anyone should really be having to hold.
Yeah, and that's happening with some of the largest artists you can imagine. And, these are conversations that are private that everybody doesn't hear. But the burnout at the level of the artist that seems like the largest artist in the world, is so intense. And then you have people who are just like, well, they signed up for this. They're public figures, and that's a thing that you hear a lot. And it's like, well, most people signed up to be artists. And there's all different kinds of artists. So yes, some people maybe just wanted the fame. But even if they did, and people don't like to talk about this, does that mean that they shouldn't get like basic human rights of fair and sustainable work conditions, right? Which means that you see these artists, big artists, they're playing arenas all the time. And then the fans are like, they seem tired, And I just saw this whole thing on Bad Bunny where people were like trashing him. This was like right after the hurricane in Puerto Rico, he didn't seem into it, he seemed tired, you know? And it was like, well, he is tired. Like he's probably just, some family members having trouble and he's doing show after show after show. And it's like there's no compassion for that because it's a sense of entitlement around entertainment that I think we have to address culturally too. It's just like, first of all, music has become devalued. It's just like music is free, which I think needs to be reevaluated. And I'm not saying that we need to go back. I know that we're not going to go back to like get rid of streaming, people buying records. I know that. But the streaming situation needs to be changed to actually be able to support the artists who are being streamed. Currently, it's like, I don't know, I'm not good at numbers, but it's like 0.0003 cents per stream, which means most artists are not seeing any income from streaming. And I'm kind of losing my train of thought. What am I talking about?
That's okay. We're talking about a dark place.
Wait, I don't want to move on because I know
streaming and
the cultural idea of being entitled, right?
Yep.
So the thing is, we have to teach people that you have to value music. So that means a child whose parents are paying the subscription and they're just streaming music, whatever, and they think it's free. Well, a parent should have a conversation and be like, hey, like there's actually an artist who's made this music and, this is how maybe we need to figure out a way as kids, to have conversations about this. The schools need to be teaching education that talks about some of these problems so that kids are coming up kind of thinking of solutions. Like just like when we teach, government, we say, this is kind of broken. This is what it is. But like, we need to think of solutions. Well, music education should be like, it's kind of broken. We need to think of solutions because this is the problem. And I think instead, it's like you flick on a light switch, you get light, you turn on a faucet, you get water, and you press a button and you get music. And so that's what people are thinking, that music is like a utility, that you're entitled to it. And it's not right. And it's not going to get us to where we need to get to. So I think there's an education component. But I also think that the idea that, that these aren't human beings and that their job is to just entertain us at any cost, and that the rate that we consume at is okay, and that there's no consideration for the fact that it's a human being. And I think that we need to reevaluate the expectations around that. Also, the way that we think of music as background now, it's like because people find music in TV and film and commercials, and through TikTok, they're thinking like, oh, music's just something that's in the background of the real stuff that's going on. So music is not, once again, valuable. And people are having these experiences, people who have shoot to stardom because of TikTok. A TikTok song blows up and they're going to shows and the crowd's like, until the one little snippet from TikTok and they're like, wow! And then, and it's like, that's not a good experience for the performer either. So it's just like, I think we need to start having conversations about how we value music and how we value entertainers.
And how I'm in a broader section, like one of the things that's on my mind is how do we, in sharing our experience, also bring this out into the communities that we're a part of? Like there should be health insurance that's accessible. There should be like the issues that we're coming up.
Childcare for mothers in music, and mothers everywhere.
Yeah.
But then for music too, there's a separate set of challenges. If you have to leave all the time to do your job and you can't afford to pay for childcare, and it's very different with the male artists who many of them have wives who stay at home and take care of the house and the kids,
Asterisk, we recognize that's not the case gender-wise across the board.
No, that's why I said many of them, because
I agree.
Many of them don't.
I heard what you said, but I just
but many of them
asterisk.
do, and I'm not going to not say that because that's true.
Yeah,
that's
a whole nother conference.
Because the industry is very male dominated, and it's a really unique experience being a woman in this industry. And part of the experience is that the men have different situations around having children. And it's a different experience. So they can they still feel good going out and, leaving for extended periods of time and know that their children and their homes are going to be taken care of. And I think it's different for many women in the industry.
1000%. I have just one or two more questions, and then we'll take a couple questions from the crew here. What are we doing wrong as artists, and how can we use our superpowers for resilience in our community? I mean, one of the things that's great across the board in the U.S. is we're seeing a labor movement that's reconnecting with workers. There's AFM. There's unions that represent music workers. There's a new collective that's working on representing artists working mostly against streaming issues. So there are sort of coalitions and collective endeavors. But like, have you thought about like, oh, if I only had this, or like, I want to talk to her or when you're doing your podcast and you're talking to other creatives, like, what are we doing wrong, or what could we be doing, or how, like, is there something that's on your mind that's just like, let's just get started with this?
I think one of the main things we're doing wrong is being quiet and not coming together. There is a sense of shame with being able to, with saying something like, I'm not able to make this work. And I think that that is something that we need to evaluate about why are we all adopting this version of success that's dictated by capitalism, and by somebody else's ideas of what success is for each individual. And I think we need to have the conversations with ourselves, because many of us have achieved great success and are struggling on such deep levels. So I think there needs to be an evaluation of that, and being able to speak up and speak out about that experience. And I think a lot of people don't, because some people aren't open to hearing it. Like, if you were to have one of the biggest artists say, oh, I'm really struggling, you're not going to, a lot of times, get any empathy from some people. But if somebody were to make a connection from the very, lowest tier of just coming up artists, who are just beginning in their level of success, to the highest, and start to draw a line between some of the problems that go across the whole thing. There's so many things that we're all experiencing that are not okay and are not acceptable. And if we can actually rally together and begin talking about these things and figuring out some of the solutions that would actually make it a fully better creative environment and career and ecosystem for everybody, then I think that we'd actually be able to unify, which is something that artists have never been able to do, like to form unions in the way that other what do you call it, industries, thank you, industries have. I think it's been a real disservice, because we haven't been able to say, no, we're not doing that, because everybody's so scared that if you say no, what will you lose? And people have a lot to lose. And I think that if we can find a way to have conversations, to find commonality, to figure out what exactly is broken and how we can fix it. And also, technology's been moving so fast. And so I think part of the problem is like, first of all, it's not just the artists who don't know what's going on. The managers don't know what's going on. The industry and the corporations don't know what's going on, but they're like, whatever's going on, we need to get on the side where the money's being made. So we don't, when streaming started, they were so lost and so confused, and they were like, all right, let's just throw the artists under the bus and like, let's get in on the business side so that, so we can figure out how we're going to be okay. So there's always been like, as technology is going, it's like the corporations are just figuring out how they're going to be okay. But the artists have been just left behind over and over again, and they always have in the music industry. So if we can't start having these honest conversations about what's hard and what's not working, and communally talking about what we can do together to fix it, then I don't think there's any hope. And also, I think social media is a big, big, big problem for so many reasons. But one of them is you're hiding behind this, facade of like being okay and not feeling, it's almost like you're trapped in this prison of that facade because you believe if you let it down, then you lose a lot of your endorsements, of your fans, or of the presumption that you're in this place where everybody wants to buy into. And if you're not really doing as good, then people are going to turn their back on you. And I think that's something that's really in the way of artists being able to like be true and honest to each other and to their fans. And if you can't be honest, then you can't get any work done.
That's a great stopping place for us because I'm with you 1000%. And I would just say that it's important, I think, for musicians to remind ourselves and each other that we have a skill set that we often don't recognize in terms of communication, in terms of tracing experience that's happening. You know, you could talk about metacognition, you could talk about just being in tune with vibes, whatever, but we have that organizational and expressive and compositional power. And that's what always makes me very excited and feel hopeful because those are my people, right? And I think that I'm curious about, we need testimony, right? And then with that testimony and with that sharing and helping each other, like I'm not naive, but I do think that there's going to have to be some major resets in technology. There's going to have to be some major resets with human rights. I mean, it's up to, I grew up with soul music in St. Louis as a kid. And I also like the first music that I remember hearing is just righteous and indie rock righteous, hip hop, right? Like it's a very powerful, righteous energy. And that's just.
But I think that's part of what commodification of music and art has done. And I think what the reason that all these corporations have been able to continue to exploit artists in this way is because they became so in control of what sells, and you can't get in unless you do exactly what sells. And their notion of what sells has become so specific, and they are controlling culture now because artists who might have had brilliant, things to say and ways of saying it and doing it differently are now struggling to make a hit that sounds just like that last hit that somebody off the TV show made or an influencer of TikTok made, because that's what sells. Because now they don't care about music anymore. Where Atlantic used to be run by people who care about music, for example, with the Arethas, and these were companies that really cared about finding something that was going to change the world. Now they're run by like money people from like other countries aren't even here. I'm not, whether they're here or not, it's not important. But the point is, they're people that are not music people. They're money people, and they're running these companies. So, A&Ring used to be finding an artist and developing an artist or whatever. Now it's like, find something that sounds just like that hit. And then when we're done with them, we're throwing them away. And then we're going to get another person sounds just like this hit. So artists are trying to make music, spending all their time trying to make their music that's not creative and not righteous.
Do you think we're losing that skill set because people are so focused on trying to answer those questions and fit that form?
I do. And also we're also controlling culture in racist ways, even. For instance, like for Black artists who are told they have to make Black music that sounds just like this, and a rap, the only rap that sells, for example, is talking about, guns and drugs and women in this way. And that's the only thing that's going to sell. Well, there's so many artists who don't want to talk about that and who aren't, but they're not going to be picked up by the major labels and they're not going to play on radio. So they're trying to talk about this stuff, but then you get the situation where all these rappers are getting killed over like their chains and stuff. And then trying to perpetuate this idea that they're rich because that's what we talk about in Black music, and half the time people are renting these chains. It's a false narrative. It's the facade that I'm talking about. And it's hurting culture because the corporations are controlling culture by what they let in the door. and what they allow you to make a living off of. And so I mean, I had to just respond to the righteous music thing because I think that
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I love it. But I think building out the conversation and connecting with each other is imperative. And I think learning to overcome shame, tell truths, and support each other when things are messy, right? I mean, I think if there's anything the pandemic offered us, that's one thing, is to give each other some grace around some messy and scary and embarrassing moments, right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We have a couple minutes for some questions. Yeah, Michael, you want to handle that?
Just wanted to say applaud and incredibly brave, frankly, of you as an artist to come out with that statement, which did hit around the world. My question is, whether you know it or not, you're now in the position where you are at the vanguard of that, and you are a disruptor. You're somebody who's saying, well, the industry isn't working. So my question really was, how has that been reacted to? The artist sits at the center of the ecosystem. Lots of people are reliant on you for the decisions that you need to make for yourself and for your career. So what did your manager think? What does your crew think? You don't have a label, but that ecosystem, what's their reaction to that? Are they supporting it? And for you personally, is there a fear of what you're doing? Do you feel like you might be damaging your career in a way that?
Sure. I feel like I stepped off the sinking Titanic and I'm in a lifeboat in the middle of a freezing ocean and I have no idea where I'm going or how I'm getting there. You know, my managers were shocked by the decision and nobody knew what to do. But then when all the support started coming in and it became a big deal, and when they saw that I got more social media coverage than than I would have gotten touring, they're like, okay, great, And I'm not saying that they don't care about me because they do. But I think there was a real fear that I was going to just ruin everything for myself. And the fact is that in a time where so many of our cultural pillars are just falling apart, whether it's government, whether it's, religion or all the different systems that we have built our lives around are falling apart. When someone tells the truth about anything, it's such a refreshing thing that I think people flock towards the truth. And I think that's what happened. That was the response. Artists were like, oh my God, thank you. And that meant a lot to me personally, because I've been hearing people talk about it, but then it just showed me. I mean, it went so much farther than people that I even knew, obviously, that were feeling the same way and struggling or out on the road. I got a lot of people out on the road. Like, I am losing so much money and I'm out here, As far as my agents, I mean, look, I had to have a talk with them and I was just like, if you guys don't bring me anything that makes sense, I'm not doing it, and that's the reality. So the challenge for them is to start thinking outside the box. How can we figure out things to do in a creative way that might make more sense, where I still get to do something for the fans, but maybe doesn't cost as much, or we figure out a way, And I don't think that most managers, agents or labels are that creative anymore. And I think that's part of the problem. So I think that it's time for some creativity and some just evaluation of how things have been working and where they need to change and how they should be working. I don't think any of those people are that good at that, the labels and the agents. There's always people who are, but I think as industries, they've stopped being creative because they're under so much pressure to meet the bottom line in this capitalist world. I mean, where art is not valued, they want to keep their jobs, they want to keep their salaries. So there's not. But what people don't know is there's always more money to be made when you think of something that works better. And I think that people are so short-sighted. They don't realize that when things are better for people, it works better. So
Yeah.
okay.
Santi, thank you so much for your time
Thank
and for your
you.
heart.
Thank you guys for inviting me.
Yeah, it's been really great to have you in the room. I know that people really appreciate you coming and spending time with us. So
Thank you. Thank you guys too.
we